Welcome. Today we're going to be adding on to additional elements that we can incorporate into an amusement or a carnival, theme park, or any other elements that you can think of that will be creative in developing out a carnival style type of design. Before we get into building out a couple additional pieces, if you look at previous videos, we've taken a look at building out a Ferris wheel or building out a tent. There are plenty of other elements that you can consider looking at. Big thing is using references to help assist you in getting the look and feel correct. But today we're going to start thinking about the landscape, making sure that we have the foundation for building out this amusement, and then getting into adding additional pieces to just enhance the overall design. You're currently seeing a ground set back with a mountainscape and then the sky in the background. Giving it an evening sky, we'll take a look at adding in fireworks or adding in stars or additional elements that really help define the landscape. If you're looking to start out, I'm going to get into understanding how to create out a mountainscape using basic tools in Photoshop, where we can use the lasso tool to help create levels of mountains to help build out what will be atmospheric perspective. Seeing mountains go into the distance, fade away, to give the appearance that we are seeing a range or distance among those actual mountains. To do this, I'm going to look to create out a new layer. Down on the bottom of the layers panel, clicking on the plus sign, I'm going to call it Mountain 2. You can see I already do have, again, the Mountain 1 already within the design. And with the Mountain 2 layer selected, I'm going to use the lasso tool. It gives me a lot more freedom in drawing out more of a jagged, rocky, realistic type of mountainscape. I'm going to start from outside the left area. And just to break it up, I don't want to draw out the same exact landscape. So I might go with either smaller hills or look to overlapping gaps between hills. Or you can add in some type of design that is more canyon-like, just to break up the design so it's not looking similar as the beginning, as what you created before. Once I get to the right side, I actually want to go down and around back to where I started. We want to enclose this shape so that we can fill it in with a solid color. Currently, I used a pink background for the mountains behind it, and I can sample the pink backgrounds by using the eyedropper tool, left side navigation, 7th icon. I click on the pink and I can see it appear in the fill color. If I want to change this, I'm actually going to make a darker variation of this color. Again, to help create out depth and show atmospheric perspective. I can look to fill this in using the paint bucket and click inside the area. Once I deselect, we can see that now we have mountains fading in the distance, two different levels. If I do decide to add in another level, again, just create out a new layer so that they're not being painted on the same layer. I'll call it Mountain 3. And again, going back over to my lasso tool, you're welcome to use the polygon lasso tool if you so choose. But I'm going to look to add in one more range of mountains just to break up the landscape. Take your time with it. It does take some getting used to when drawing out with a mouse. But once I have this, I'm going to look to fill it in again, this time using a darker purple color. And I'm going to put a little bit more blue to the color just so we're finding a separation again and starting to blend in towards the ground that we have in the foreground. So if I use the paint bucket, click inside the area. If I don't like the color, I can always go back to modifying it, go to slightly but more purple. If you decide you want to try a different landscape, you're always welcome to go with your own style. If I decide that I want to do more of a cityscape, as an example, I do have a cityscape already created to give us one level. If I move this layer up, We can see that the mountainscape or the cityscape is sitting in front of the mountains, so we're giving it that mountainscape in the background. Just for modifying the color, it is easy to go to Image, Adjustments, and Hue and Saturation, or Command or Control U to go into the panel, in which I can either look to darken up the colors or modify the colors with the hue, just to create a different variation of color. And right now I just want to go a little bit darker with it, just so it stands out from the mountainscape behind. Once I have that landscape, how I built this out was just using basic tools like the rectangle marquee tool, or using the elliptical marquee tool for any rounded areas, or the polygonal lasso tool that gives you a lot better control when drawing out more abstracted shapes. So again, I'm going to create a new layer. It's going to sit above this cityscape. I'll call it Cityscape 2. And again, I'm going to go over to my rectangular marquee tool to start out the design. Within the area, I can think about whether I want to have the mountainscape, the cityscape sitting behind certain areas. I'm going to move this one. You can see a different variation of objects or buildings. So something can look like a church or look like a tall high-rise. It's up to you to kind of figure out the design that you're looking for. But once I have these buildings, I'm going to again make sure I'm on the new layer, and I can use the rectangle marquee tool to start building out other shapes. The good thing is I have the ground currently sitting in front of all my cityscape or mountainscapes. This permits me to be able to draw in pieces down below the area. You can see I'm going down below the horizon line. And even though there are just basic shapes right now, we can add in additional details momentarily. I am looking to keep a couple of the gaps just so it is showing a differentiation between the buildings and that they do have a couple separate elements. We don't want all the buildings to look exactly the same. But once I have the first layer, I could look to fill it in right now, or I can look to add in additional elements. If I want to add in additional elements, I'm just going to go over to the elliptical marquee tool. Remember, if I want to add in shapes, I can hold down Shift on my keyboard, click and drag to add in elements that are going to get added into that selection. So if I want smaller shapes, I can draw out smaller circles or squares. Think about it, might have antennas or attachments on the buildings so that they're not all flat. If I want to make something more jagged, I can consider going over to the polygonal lasso tool. Third tool, left side navigation. Again, I can hold down Shift to add in details on top of a building. Give this more of a spear on top of the building. But make sure to attach back to where you started so it gets added into the piece. Not all roofs are going to be just flat squares. They are going to have jagged elements to break up the building, so it is a little bit separated. So once I do have additional pieces on top, I can look to fill this in. Again, I can sample the building color that I currently have, and maybe I'll go with a darker variation of that color, or maybe pick a little bit more bluish tone so it starts to blend in with the bottom of my landscape for the ground. So I can use the paint bucket to fill in that area. If they are too dark, we can always get into modifying the color scheme, but we do want to get the sense that the buildings are getting closer, the objects are getting closer to us. So again, if I do want to modify these out a bit, I can select on layers, Command or Control U, and look to adjust the tones as needed. So you can see now with the buildings and having the mountains in the background, we are creating what is more atmospheric perspective, showing objects losing detail or starting to blend into the atmosphere as it gets further away. Again, if I do want to make any modifications, maybe it's making a modification to my gradient, the background color, I can use the gradient tool to redraw out colors or shorten up the gradient so I'm picking up more of the pink colors. It helps to blend into the background a little bit better. Just make some minor tweaks to hopefully enhance the design. Now that we've taken care of the background, I want to think about additional elements that I can add in. If I wanted to do, say, stars, I can create out, again, a layer, and I'll rename it out stars. With the stars layer, I'm just going to go over to a brush tool, left side navigation, ninth icon, and I can use a small brush. I'm going to use a soft brush just so we create a little bit of blend. Remember that we can adjust the size of our brush. If we hit right bracket, the brush gets bigger. Left bracket makes it smaller. And just for more sporadic type of brush, I'm going to look to fill in a couple white dots to fill into the sky area. So if I simply click, I can add in a couple variations of dots just to fill in the night sky. If I want to go smaller with it, just reduce down the size of the brush, just so we're seeing a difference in the size, that they don't all look the same. If you want to build out what would be a constellation, you can think about what that looks like. But just those little dots allow us to get a more sense that this is a night sky, that we are creating a scene. If you decide to want to add in other elements, maybe a shooting star or add in a moon, we'll talk about that momentarily. Of course, as it gets darker in the night scene, we are seeing more stars towards the darker area. And if I feel like the sky needs to be modified in any way, I can look to adjust the sky colors, maybe add in another color just so it is creating more darkness. So I'm just giving more of an evening into sunset, or from a sunset into more evening sky. So it's a little bit easier to see those stars at night when it is that darker sky. But once I have the sky, we can look to, again, create out a new layer. And this time I'll do a moon, and I'll just keep to a basic shape like a crescent moon, which I'll look to draw out again on a new layer. Rename it out. It's always good to keep your layers organized. Hold down Shift to draw out with the elliptical marquee tool, and I can fill this in with a white or blue or gray color. I'll go soft gray blue. Once I have that drawn out, I can look to draw out another circle that's going to look to cut out this area. If I need to adjust, I can use the arrow keys on my keyboard to modify the location and simply hit backspace, cutting out that area from the moon. If I want to adjust it anyway, I can move the placement or hit Command or Control T to rotate the object as I prefer. You may want to also consider playing effects on the object. If I wanted to double click on the layer or go down to FX, I can look to add in an outer glow or maybe add in details like three-dimensionality. So if I wanted to try bevel and emboss to get a little bit more shadow on the object, I could test out, experiment how that's going to look. Just a little bit of shadow gives it a more three-dimensional look. And feel free to kind of experiment with the angle, how the light might be hitting the object. Once I have a bevel or emboss, I'm going to go down to adding an outer glow. With the outer glow, I'm going to pick up more of a bluish purple sky, but with a lighter variation. Once I have a color I like, I can look to adjust on my size to modify how much the moon is going to glow. If I want to drop the color a little bit more, get more variation on that color, I can take a look at pushing up the size. Blend modes do give us the ability to edit and see if blends are going to look better or help change the design in any way. Take your time to go through them. You may find ones that you like or ones that just definitely don't work. Or if I do like one, I could always play and experiment with modifying the opacity, see how much better it can work. If there are any colors that just don't work, keeping the standard color that you originally chose with the normal setting should work overall, but again, you can experiment to see how it's going to blend. So once I have the glow effect, again, I can kind of experiment, see if the colors work. Now we have a nice evening sky or night sky. I may want to think about adding in elements to the sky, say fireworks, or you can consider a hot air balloon. Take a look at one of my previous videos, talk about the hot air balloon. But I'm going to look to create out a new layer. And if I wanted to get into fireworks, I'm going to rename this out Firework 1. there's two different methods that we can go with for fireworks, or there's plenty of different methods you can kind of experiment with. Don't be afraid, again, to look up resources to give you some inspiration on how to do it. But for my first method, I'm going to use the brush tool, left side navigation. With the brush tool, I'm going to go over to Window and Brush Settings. In the brush settings, there are plenty of options to kind of go through, scroll around to see if you can find something that works for you. I'm going to go to more of a speckled type of brush, and I can take a sample, check out the size to see what it looks like up closer. For the speckled brush, even though it looks jagged, looks rough, it should work for what we're trying to do with the style choice. I'm going to take a look. If I do want to make any modifications, I may want to give it an angle jitter, just so I consistently am not seeing the same circle shape every time. But with the brush now filled out, I want to pick out a color for my firework. I'll start out with the blue just so we can easily see it from the background. With the brush selected, I'm just going to look to click, and I can click a few times just to make this a little bit stronger, or even increase the size of the brush to add in a little bit more of the sparkle effect. Once I have that sparkle effect, I'm actually going to reduce the brush down a little bit and change the color out to white. Adding in this white will help to give a sense of where the explosion started from, that it is dispersing out into the scene and exploding in the night sky. Once I have this drawn out, I could take a look at adding in, say, an outer glow. Again, I already do have a blue color tone, so it works for my design, just to give that vibrance of color exploding in the night sky. Feel free to experiment, again, test out different options, how it's going to blend. For elements, so once I have a subtle element that gives that the glow effect, if I wanted to maintain the same idea, I could actually just take what I've just created, hold down Alt or Option, and click and drag to create out a duplicate. If I rotate this on an angle, I can change up the different placement or scale it down so we're creating variation in the explosions. If I want to change the color, I can hit, again, Control U and look to adjust the hue to pick out a different color tone. So if I want to do yellow or red, I can see what those colors look like. The one modification I will have to make is adjusting out our outer glow. So if I go over to red for right now, just to see it, again, I want to change out my outer glow color. And some colors are a little bit more strong than others, so I may have to reduce down, say, the opacity of the color, just so it translates a little bit better for the explosion. So again, I can make out multiple different copies, add in the same colors or different colors. But it's very easy to, once you create out one, to create out multiple variations of it. So even if they're dispersed, separated around, we're starting to build out what looks like a fireworks show happening in the scene. Throw one more color change on this. Command or Control U brings up the hue and saturation, and I can look to adjust to more of a green color. But there are several ways of doing fireworks. If you want to go another method, I'm going to create a new layer. I'll call it Firework 2. This is more similar to how the Ferris wheels build out, or you can get into a standard brush and looking to build out a brush. Over in our brush settings, so again, there are usually plenty of options in the brush settings that we can take a look at, kind of view to explore. And some of the brushes that I do have, you may not have, so you kind of have to test and see which ones are going to work for you. In a couple of my brush settings, I do have ones that look more like a flower effect. If I create out spacing, we can see a separation of this. We see how it has a radial variation on it. And again, there are a lot of brushes similar to that, or something that might work better for you. And as many times as I've been in Photoshop, there are always brushes that surprise me or realize I haven't really experimented with. If I wanted more of a star effect, and I increase the size on this, I can get more of an explosion. If I want to add into that, so I can create different variations or explosions within my design. So you can see how fun and creative some of these can be. But more traditional variations that we can explore is possibly looking at building out with the polygon lasso tool. With this new layer, I'm going to go over to the polygon lasso tool, look to draw out what will look like a laser beam kind of shooting off, where it's thicker on one side, and I can fill it in with white. I'm going to deselect. With this shape, I'm going to hold down Alt to create out a duplicate, and I can hit Command or Control T to rotate this around. So it faces the opposite direction, and I can stick the closer ends to each other, the small ends towards each other. I'm going to select out both layers. Again, right-click on the layer over the Layers panel and duplicate. Click OK, Control or Command T. Rotate it 90 degrees. Now select all 4 layers. Right-click and duplicate. Command or Control T. I can rotate it more on a 45-degree angle. If I want to get into modification of size, I can hold down Alt or Option to scale it down on the interior. Or if I want to select out all the layers that make up this shape, duplicate one last time, Command or Control T, and I can rotate this so more of a starburst type of explosion. But with all these layers selected that makes up the shape, I'm going to highlight them over in the Layers panel, right click, and I can hit Merge Layers to combine them into one. Now with this, I can look to create out more of a blur effect or show motion on this object. I'll go over to the blur section. I can experiment with different blurs, see which one works for mine. The Gaussian blur is not a great example because it will just blend out the entire object. But if I try more of a motion blur or lens blur, or even a radial blur, we should get to see an experiment with how it can modify a shape. If one doesn't work, just hit Command or Control Z to undo. You can see over to the right side, I currently have and some will work and some will not. So you kind of have to just kind of keep experimenting. It's hard to see it on this transparent background. I'm going to hit cancel just because I'm not seeing what I like. But again, back up to filter, blur. Maybe I'll try a motion blur on this object. If I move the distance, I can see how it's going to affect the image. Understand this is not necessarily going to work because it is limited on the direction that motion travels. When it comes into using, say, something like the lens blur, I'm going to center this object just so I can get a true blend off of this using blur, and I'll try out radial blur or lens blur. Lens blur is not the best option, and this is all about experimentation. So don't think that somebody knows everything about these programs. It's kind of a learning process for everyone. And there's always being tools available in Photoshop to learn. Try out the radial. Just see how it affects the object. You can see it's not necessarily doing exactly what I'm looking for. But what I can look to do instead is try experimenting with the warp and how I might be able to modify or squish the shape around. If I want to warp the shape, I'm going to hit Command or Control T, right click on the object, and I'm going to first choose warp. With warp, if I do want to see the grid, I can show 3x3 just to see the circles inside. I can look to grab in areas to modify the shape. If you don't like it how it is, I'm just going to hit cancel. Again, Command or Control T, right click and warp. You can modify the grid system to default to see how it's going to change the shape, or maybe morph it. Pull down on sides to get it more draping and drooping off the explosion. You can see as I pull it out, it gives more of a flare effect. And it can be tedious, but I'm going to grab these anchor points to morph the shape as needed. So once I hit OK, right now it is very sharp, and I do probably want to soften this up a little bit. So I can go back up to Filter, down to Blur. This time I'm just going to keep to a standard type of Gaussian blur, just to modify the settings as I prefer. If I want to duplicate this out, or if I want to add in effects to make it glow, again, FX, outer glow. I can look to play with the color. I'll try yellow just to make it stand out. Once I put the opacity, we can definitely see it a lot stronger. I may want to consider an outer glow or adding in a color overlay, just so we're seeing the color pop out better. But it's for you to kind of experiment with, see how the color is going to affect the objects. Once I do have a glow effect on this, I can look to duplicate. Just hold down Alt, click and drag, and I can rotate around, have a couple bursting in different locations. Or play with the size so that they are different. So it creates out a very nice firework display. It's breaking it up so it's not all the same. But this is where you get to kind of experiment and add your own creativity into the design. So once I have a fireworks display, I can consider getting into now adding in elements that build onto the landscape. Again, we've already taken a look at the Ferris wheel or building out a tent in other videos. Feel free to refer back to them. But for tonight, we're going to take a look at getting into building other objects that you can incorporate, whether they're snack stands or other elements. Do some research or see what other things are available. First, we're going to actually take a look at building out a roller coaster. And to build out a roller coaster, the best option is truly to use the pen tool to help build out the track for our coaster. With the track, I am going to click on the pen tool, left side navigation. I do want to make sure that the brush or the pen tool is set to shape. I'm going to have no fill, and the size of my roller coaster I'm going to set to 30 pixels. With 30 pixels, I'm going to look to start drawing out. Understand that, for an example, I do want to explain that drawing out with a pen tool, if I want to draw out a straight line, I would want to click point, move over to new area, and click another point, and it automatically makes a connection between point A to point B. If I want to end the line, I can just hit escape. Hitting escape on my keyboard ends the line so that I can start a new line. If I don't hit escape, and I go to click a third point, it will automatically connect to make a connection between the objects. But if we want to get into building out something a little bit more realistic, like a roller coaster that has curves and has loops or up and downs, we need to show curved lines. To do a curved line, I'm not just going to simply draw out a straight line, but I'm going to click and drag to create out a curve connecting between point A to point B. So you can see that as I adjust with my mouse, the line is going to bend up or down. If I pull it downward, it's going to bend the line upward, more of a hill. When I release, again, I can hit escape, or to bend down to create more of a smile. I can bend downward or pull upward to bend the line downward. When I release, we get that line again. So even though we do have a couple simple lines from point A to point B, if we want more complicated variations, we're going to look to add in multiple curved lines together. I'm going to start thinking about as a track, it's going to have a beginning where it starts out flat. I'm going to connect point A to point B. For the next portion, I'm going to look to draw out the climb up the roller coaster. So I'm going to click and drag to start the curve for my line. Once I have the curve, I can move upward in the direction I want to go. And to make it easy for myself, I may want to cut off the curved element. To cut off the curved element, I'm going to hold down Alt, ALT on my keyboard, or Option, and click on the anchor point I just made. Doing this gives me a straight line that I can automatically start from, continuing the line, but automatically give me a straight line. This gives me the upward angle so that I can look to then click and drag to create out the drop, the first drop that we're going to have for our roller coaster. Once I have that first drop, I can think about how that coaster might go down into a second drop or might go into a turn. But for just right now, we're going to look to do another loop or another bump. So from here, I can click and drag to create out a second area for the ramp or for the coaster to flow through. Once I get down to this other side, I can continue the curve, or I can look to draw out my own. If I do want to again end the curve, I can hold down Alt or Option, click on the anchor point, and then look to create out my own next curve. So I can think about maybe it's a loop-de-loop, or that the coaster turns sideways and has a harsh rotation and twist, or I can go into a loop or a steep drop. It's up to you to kind of really determine what you're looking for in a roller coaster. So I want to go into a loop-de-loop, but I got to set myself up for the curve. First, I'm going to hold down Alt or Option to cut off the anchor point I just made so that I can click and drag and create out the next line that I need. If I don't want it to be in the same area as my big first drop, just to create a little bit more design element, maybe I go right into the loop on the next portion. The big part is that you maintain the correct curve that you need to get the loop looking like you want. And give it a zigzag bend. Or another loop just to break up the design. But I eventually want to get back to where I started and connect back to the original starting point. If I mess up on a line, I can always hit Command or Control Z to step back. And to close up this line, I am going to connect back to where I started, but I may have to end the curve because it is already a sharp curve. I'm going to look to click on the anchor point I created and then close up to where I started. So I know this seems like chaos, or maybe you want to add in your own details. You absolutely can. For myself, I'm just trying to show you the basics of how to build out the line. Once we have the line for our coaster, I'm going to hit Escape to end it. Now we need to build out the framework for the coaster itself. With the framework, we're going to use the pen tool again, but I'm going to change out the color to gray. Just thinking about the structure of how it's built, how the poles are going to have to support the area. Make sure that you select off and create a new layer just so you're not painting on the actual coaster. So if I wanted to keep the blue, make sure to create a new layer so it's not interfering with the color that you have. But for my bars, I'm going to reduce this down to about 18 pixels. Just so I have a thinner variation. And what I'm looking to do is draw out multiple lines. For multiple lines, this is all straight lines, but I can click at a certain point, hold down Shift, and it'll automatically make a connection down to the new area. Hit Escape so you can begin another line. Again, just repeat this process to start building out the framework you need for the structure. Eventually, I will put the blue track over top of the gray lines. Right now, I'm just trying to get the structure for our roller coaster. As it gets into more complicated areas, we don't necessarily want to be overlapping all the time. Just think about where people would need to see lines to really understand the structure and how objects are going to rotate through this coaster. I may go with shorter lines as it gets further away. And again, I'm just hitting Escape to end the line so we have a sense of where the coaster is going. And I may take some creative liberties making sure that I don't interfere with the loop or give a sense of where the loop is going to divide from the rest of the track. And we are going to end up with a ton of layers from doing this. Each layer is creating out, or each line that we create out is creating out a new layer. But we'll look to consolidate those momentarily once we get all the lines in. The reason why I may go with shorter lines occasionally is to give the sense that the coaster is not just going flat parallel to the ground, but that it is giving variations. It does jump up in certain areas to create out separation. But again, just to make sure that we do understand what's going on with the scene, I do want to move the blue part of our track of the coaster in front of everything else. So I'm going to hit Command or Control Shift right bracket to move the blue line above all the gray lines. I know that all the gray lines are made up of all these shape 2 through 43. It does take a lot to accomplish or get this done. But what we're going to look to do is actually combine all these pieces. If I'm definitely satisfied with the look and feel of my roller coaster, I'm going to first right click on the layers once they're all selected and hit rasterize layers. You can always look to duplicate them out and have an extra copy if you do want to make edits or if you need to make edits later on. But I'm rasterizing this so that I can flatten it, merging the layers into one single layer. So if I hide this, it works as one. Little details that I may want to focus on is adding in some shadows so we can understand how the track is overlapping, some areas being in front of the others. So if I zoom in closer towards where I have the loop in the back, I'm going to use the polygonal lasso tool or the regular lasso tool to draw over around sections where I'm going to shade. I'm going to click point by point to draw around the area that I want to shade. So if I wanted to shade this area on the blue part of the track, I have the layer currently selected. I'm going to choose the burn tool. With the burn tool, I'm going to change out the highlights because we're dealing with a light blue color. And I'm just looking to give a subtle burn that helps separate and create the sense of depth on the track. That the loop is in front of these areas. I'm only clicking and dragging to create a sense of where that shadow helps separate the object on the track. Might be a subtle element. If I want to step back, I can take a look and see if midtones might look better. But again, with the burn tool, instead of doing highlights, I'll go midtones. Once I get over on the one side, I can take a look at the right side. Again, with the polygonal lasso tool, gives you a little bit better control. I'm going to zoom in, give a sense that the loop is going to be in front of the first drop. So I'm going to draw around just the first drop area. Hold down Shift if you want to add in multiple selections. Just try to think about the direction that the track is taking the roller coaster, so you yourself can make sense of how the shadows should be hitting the object. And I'm just drawing out all these selections so I can get it out of the way now. Once I have all those areas drawn out, now I can look to burn again. I could again experiment, see if I did get a different color tone over areas. You can see that with the shadow effect, I get a little bit more bluish tone rather than gray. But we're not looking to go overboard. We're just trying to give a separation so we can understand where the track progresses. And we want to make sure not to go too far into the design. But once I'm satisfied with it, I can click off of it. Now, because I added those little subtle shadows, it helps to give a separation, understanding that the track falls behind certain areas within the design. If I want to play with the scale of this object, I can hit Command or Control T, reduce this down so it's fitting better to the scene that I'm looking for. Again, we can have many different things happen in a carnival. Good example where we have lights, or we add in a ticket booth. If I do want to add in a ticket booth or signage, I go over to the object that I created. I'm going to look to use the polygon lasso tool to draw out a sign area. If I wanted to use more of the shapes tool, I could use the pen tool itself to draw out shapes as well. But for this, I'm going to draw out with a shape and just give myself a standard white color and no stroke, or go with a minimum color stroke. So let's go lighter color. Go into the color picker, pick out a color, or just make sure it stands out. Something different from the red that I currently have on the building. With the pen tool, the shape selected, I have a white fill, blue stroke. I'm going to look to draw out a angled sign. I'm going to hold down Alt, draw the right side, and connect back to where I started. Once I have that shape, just understand that you do want the layer in front of the object that you may have drawn. Currently my layer 27 was way behind a lot of objects, so I had to shift it up and make sure it is appearing in front of the signage that I'm looking for. I can see that the stroke is too strong, so I'm going to reduce this down. Once I have that, I'm going to go over to the capital T icon, click and drag to create out text, in which I'm going to write in ticket or ticket booth. With the text, I don't want it to be flat, so with the capital T icon selected, I'm going to go up to our transform tool. But with the text, I need to have it highlighted. And I'm going to center the text just so it fits into the middle of the scene. And I'm going to scale this up a little bit. Highlighting in that area, I can scale up the size of the text so it fits better to the area that I want. Once I have this, I'm going to again highlight the text and go over to our warp of text. I'm going to go to an arc, and with the arc, I want to look to place this in so it fits better. May have to reduce the bend a little bit, and I'm going to play with the distortion so it's a little bit wider over on the left than it is on the right side. With this, still a little bit big, so I can always scale it down or squeeze it in to fit better to the area that I want. Or if it needs some manipulation, I can hit Command or Control T, right click, and I can look to warp it more, playing with the angles or perspective a bit. And you can do different signage for different areas. If I wanted to create out a lamppost, some type of light source, just to build it out. I will go through once I have, again, my other variation of a light. So to create this same idea, I'm going to create a new layer. Use a rectangle tool to draw out a shape. I can go over to my elliptomarquee tool, hold shift to draw out the circle on top of this. Where I would recommend fill it in first so you can easily see that you have things aligned where you want. Once I have the first shape, draw a circle on the top. I can always nudge it into the correct placement where I want, and then fill it in again. I'll look to draw out with the rectangle marquee tool. Just a bar that goes across. I can adjust the placement momentarily. But I'm going to again fill it in with a color. Now I'm going to hit Command or Control T, right click and warp. With the warp, I want to zoom in a little bit because I'm going to modify grabbing the sides, pulling it down to modify the shape so it is rounded. Rather than a flat shape, we're going to create what looks like a bending pole for the light. I can do it on the right side as well. Pulling in on the side, grabbing these little circles. Once I'm satisfied with the shape, just hit enter. I can deselect, and we see that we have now more of a rounded pole on the top portion. I'm going to look to draw out a rectangle shape and fill this in with gray. Use the paint bucket, fill it in. And again, I'm going to hit Command or Control T. This time I'm going to do a distort, in which I can grab the sides to pull it in. And I'm going to shift this up on top of where it meets the pole, the bent pole. And hit enter. Now to add in a light, I'm going to look to draw out with the elliptical marquee tool. With the elliptical marquee tool, I'm going to draw a circle that appears down, so I'm only getting this bottom portion, in which I'm going to fill in with a yellow color. But I'm only going to click on the bottom half of this section. So when I click in this area, it only fills on this bottom portion. I can deselect. Now we have a light on our light post. I'm going to create out a new layer now and look to build out what will be a glowing effect for our light post, in which I'm going to draw a more curved line down on the bottom portion and then back up to the outside edge of this light. With this drawn out, we're going to go over to our gradient tool, and we're going to use, again, where the paint bucket is located, go to the gradient. We're going to use the standard or the normal gradient, and I'm going to look to pick out a yellow to white light source. If you don't see it, I'm going to first just go to my basics. So right now I'm seeing my foreground color set to yellow, and I'm going to go into the basics and pick out a yellow to transparent color. The idea of this is that when I draw out with a gradient, we want the gradient to travel from brighter to lighter, or to transparent. Like you see with the example, I'm clicking and dragging downward. It is a little bit sharp on the edges, but I do want that transparency to happen on the bottom where it disappears. The final step is just to blur this out. To blur this out, I'm going to look to soften up on the mask itself. I go up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. With the Gaussian Blur, I'm going to look to adjust the radius to get that softer edge around the light. So that allows me to create out a light source. Feel free to test and experiment. But the whole idea is that we start to build piece by piece to create an assemblage of shapes and objects to create out something pretty cool. The final piece that we'll look at for this demonstration is building out more of a carousel. It'd be a very simplified carousel as we're running long on time, but I don't want to keep you here all night. I'm going to first just shift these pieces over, get them out of the way. For a carousel, I'm going to start out with a base, get the foundation of what I'm looking for. I go over to the rectangle marquee tool, create out a new layer, click and drag to create out a rectangle, and I can fill this in. Whether you want to go with a flat color or gradient, that is up to you. I'm click inside, and then I can use the rectangle marquee tool to draw out more design elements on this. Draw a little line to break up the top and bottom. Just click inside the area with the paint bucket. We get that break on the shape. If you wanted to affect certain pieces of this, if I wanted to darken up aspects so that it does look a little bit different, I'm going to use the rectangle marquee tool, or sorry, the polygon lasso tool, draw around the area that I want to modify. And if I go up to Image, Adjustments, Brightness, and Contrast, I can darken up the area that I select so that it creates more of a shadow effect on the design. So again, if I go Image, Adjustments, Brightness, and Contrast, if I push up push down the brightness, it allows me to get a shadow effect as if the sun or the light source is casting on the object. I just click OK. Now when I click off of it, we get a break inside the object. Then we're going to draw out, I'm going to create out a new layer just to be safe. I'm going to draw the center of my carousel, fill it in with a yellow color. I'm going to hit deselect, but hit Command or Control T and hit perspective to reduce down the interior so we get a wider top portion. If I did want to modify this more, I could hit warp and look to grab in the sides so it creates more of an angled effect. I'm keeping it relatively symmetrical on both sides. But once I'm satisfied with it, let's just hit enter. Next portion on the top, again, clicking drag and create out a rectangle. I can use the eyedropper tool to match to a color if I want to fill that in with the same color. Click inside the area. If I want to draw out a specific shape or add in a detail design to this, what I'm going to do is create out a square shape, and I'm going to fill this in on a new layer and fill it in with yellow. So I can match the eyedropper, match the yellow that I already have going, and use the paint bucket to fill in this shape. The reason why I did this, I'm going to deselect and hit Command or Control T. I'm going to rotate it so it's going to sit along the edge of this shape. I'm going to make sure that it does align to the top and bottom edge. If it doesn't, I can scale it down as needed. I get that little pink line to appear to make sure that I am getting it aligned where I want. Once I have it aligned on the top, bottom, and side, I'm going to click on the Move tool, hold down Alt or Option, click and drag to create out a duplicate. I'm going to look to create out a couple copies. And even if it doesn't line up perfectly, we can get into modifying the scale in momentarily. So you can see that they do run along. But what I'm going to do is select out all the shapes that make up those diamond shapes. Hit Command or Control T, hold Shift and grab the side to squeeze this in, just so it fits to the design as I want. So I have a little design element to our piece. If I want to get into adding in a roof line, I'm going to go over to my polygon lasso tool. Again, I'm going to create out a new layer. I'm going to go from top of my design, a little bit inside the corners. Again, I did create a separate layer so it can be on a different panel. I can use the paint bucket to fill in the area. I'm going to deselect. If I want to add in some design elements, I may want to consider adding in some stripes. I go to the polygon lasso tool. How I'm going to separate it is based off of the diamond shapes on top. Just makes it easy to identify. Then I can use the paint bucket to fill in this space. Use the eyedropper tool to match the color that you want, and use the paint bucket to paint it in. If I do want to manipulate the shape, I can always hit Command or Control T, right click, and warp. With the warp, I can get into pulling in the sides. If I want to give it a more squish feeling, or that the tent is kind of puckering in. Because it is such a wide shape, it is taking a little bit to pucker, but just take your time to try getting it as accurate as you want. So once I have the foundation, I may want to consider adding in some bars. I'm going to create out a new layer again. Using the rectangle marquee tool, I'm going to look to draw out a bar for where the animals and will attach. I can draw out one, fill it in. And then hold down Alt or Option to make duplicates of those bars. Using a couple darker bars gives the sense that there are bars around the other sides. Just helps to understand that they're further away. So rather than trying to draw out a specific animal, I can use a couple of tools to steal some concepts or get a little bit easier time to draw out a shape. To draw out a animal shape, I go over to what is known as our custom shapes tool. Custom shapes over on the bottom left side. On the top right side, there are actual examples of animals that give us silhouettes. If I wanted to do a rhino, I can click and drag. Imagine that this is a kid's ride, so you can think about how the rhino might sit or manipulate. I can hold shift to squish it in to fit better to the area. Make sure to think about the color scheme. I'm going to go back over to my custom shapes tool, eliminate out the stroke, just so we're seeing the silhouette of the rhino. I can test out other animals. Again, go back to the custom shapes. Maybe I want to do a lion. Click and drag to create out a lion. I'm going to Control T to flip it so they're all going the same direction. And if I want to change out the color, I can change the fill, go more orangish color. But there are a number of different animals to choose from the wild animal section. If you want to have somebody riding a moose or riding a deer, so this at least gives a sense of how we can create out elements that break up and show creativity and show originality in your design. So you can always add in more. Just think about the details that help build out the overall look and feel that you're looking for. Any other details that you want to add, that's up to you. But I could go on for hours or days doing different designs. It's a matter of seeing where you can be creative and come up with something for yourself. If you want to modify a layer, just know what layer you're selecting. You can use the move tool to click on the layer that you want. I can go over to image adjustments, brighten some contrast, darken up some areas, to grade out some shadows. So many different things that you can experiment with. I hope you can take something away from this tutorial, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Have a great night.